I think I had issues with audio there. Let me just double check here. All right, I apologize for that. Let me do that. Let me repeat what you were seeing me voice, but you weren't hearing. Thank you to each of you for joining us this morning. I am Karma Bauman. I've been using Photoshop for many, many years. Before we get into the content, just want to introduce myself real quickly and then jump into the content. Thank you for those reminders about the audio that you sent over. I appreciate it. Which reminds me, so below the video that you are watching is a form for you to fill out if you have any questions or comments, ideas. Don't hesitate to fill that in and send it across, and I will see that at my end. All right, a little bit about myself, and then we'll get started into talking about Photoshop layers this morning. I've been using Photoshop for a number of years and used Photoshop for doing some graphic design, web design work, working with images, creating brochures or posters. Used it in many different aspects. But what I enjoy most is training others how to use Photoshop. And so that's kind of why I do these webinars as well. This morning we're talking about Photoshop layers. Let me jump over into my presentation for this. 1 second as I get my screen ready to share. All right. Today, more specifically, we're going to talk about what is a layer. Layers are very foundational to the use of Photoshop, so I consider layers as one of the essential concepts that one needs to grasp and understand when using Photoshop. So we'll start at the very basics. I'll also talk about the purpose of layers. I'll talk about the different types of layers, and then as well as managing layers. So let's jump in. What is a layer? Now we're all very familiar seeing the Photoshop layer panel. Let me bring that up really quick. Inside Photoshop, over at the bottom right, sits the layers panel. Whoops. And what that is simply a way that Photoshop manages pixels. Photoshop doesn't know about the different types of elements in our Photoshop document. It doesn't know that these are people and these are trees and this is the sea. It's just simply everything is pixels to Photoshop. How we see it, though, we do see those different types of elements, whether it's an image, parts of an image, whether it's a graphic, a logo, whether it's text. So we see that. Photoshop doesn't think that way. It's down into zeros and ones when it comes to computers. So Photoshop sees pixels. So the way we can more easily manage those different types of elements and move them around and move them up or down, we use layers inside Photoshop to do that. And what that does for us, it gives us a lot more flexibility in moving and changing and rearranging those elements. We can add styles to those elements. We can fade them back. We can do all different types of things with individual elements versus the entire document. So that's how we keep things individualized inside Photoshop, is using layers. When we do something with a layer, it affects everything in that layer. That's why we put individual elements on its own layer, so we can only affect that one element versus everything in the document. So it's a way of organizing elements in our Photoshop files and our Photoshop documents. The question there about, is there a limit to the number of layers inside Photoshop? That's a good question. It used to be 99, but I've been using Photoshop for so long, so I doubt if that limit is still there. It's probably whatever you need. What I would suggest, though, is keeping your layers manageable. We're going to talk about a specific type of layer called a smart object layer. You don't want to get so many layers in your document that it becomes unwieldy and hard to maintain or hard to manage at some point. Smart object layers might be one way to keep that manageable if you're approaching lots and lots of layers. I would say approaching, I don't know, 50 plus layers. We'll also talk about grouping layers, which also helps keeping it manageable. The purpose of layers. As we already discussed, it's a way to organize all our different elements inside a document. Now, elements, if you recall, elements can be text, it can be a graphic, it can be an image, it can be another image. So it's individual objects or items that are inside our Photoshop document. We also use layers to maintain the original image. I always like to. Sometimes I like to, sometimes it actually I do differ because I forget, but I always like to keep the original image as is. So if I'm working on a picture or an image, I like to keep the bottom layer original, make a copy of it, and then work on the copied. So I'm going to show you this really quick, how to do this inside Photoshop. Here's an image of some lavender. Now, if I want to do something with this image, first I just open it up inside Photoshop. So it's simply a JPEG that I opened in Photoshop. You see the background layer here. We're going to talk about what the background layer is in just a sec. But instead of making changes to this, which actually you're limited to what you can do, because it is a background layer, and you see this little lock icon here indicating that we can't make changes to that. So what I do is simply do a Control J, or on the Mac side it'll be a Command J, and it makes a copy of that layer. So now I can do whatever I want to on this layer. So that's a good habit, practice to get into when you're working with images inside Photoshop. And this is applicable to if you're going to make changes to an image. Not so applicable if you're creating a new document and say it's a poster or a brochure or a flyer. There you're going to bring in all kinds of different types of objects. So you're starting from a blank document. But this is very applicable to when it comes to working with images. All right, so that's how I maintain the original image when I work on images inside Photoshop. Control J or Command J to make a duplicate. The types of layers. And I will introduce you. Yeah, we'll go into these deeper as we proceed through the presentation. But types of layers, we start with the background layer, which is actually an image type layer, if you will, which we just noticed. We'll talk more about that in just a sec. Then we have image layers. Image layer is the default layer inside Photoshop. Whenever you add a layer or bring in a graphic from another file into your Photoshop document, it's going to create an image layer to do that. We have type or text layers. I did a webinar several weeks ago about creating type or adding text to our Photoshop documents. So whenever we add text to our document, it's going to create by default a text layer. We also have shape layers. If I want to maybe add a rectangle behind some text to help it stand out more from the busy background, I'm going to use a shape layer. So we'll look at that inside Photoshop briefly. We have adjustment layers. We can do, and probably will do a whole webinar on just adjustment layers. Adjustment layers are a great way to manipulate your image. You want to turn it to black and white. You want to remove a tint or some other kind of color adjustment or color correction. Adjustment layers are great for that. And then there's a smart object layer, which I mentioned briefly earlier. The smart object layer is I would call that more of a complex layer, but we'll get more into that in just a sec. Let's talk about each of these types of layers in a little more in depth. The background layer is the default layer when you open an image. So if I do a file open from inside Photoshop and go open any kind of image, it will open up as a background layer. It is always locked, as we noticed when we were in that lavender image. If I want to make any changes to that, I need to either unlock the background layer or create a duplicate layer, which is my recommended and preferred way of doing it via the Control or Command J option. However, if you don't do that, there is a way to unlock it. Let's go back inside Photoshop so I can show this to you. I'm going to delete the layer I created. I'm going to show this in more detail in just a sec. But here's the background layer. I already showed you the Control J or Command J option to create a duplicate. You can also just click on this lock to unlock it. Now I can make changes to the original image. As soon as I clicked on that icon, let me do a Control Z to bring that back. As soon as I click on the lock icon, notice my layer, first the lock disappears, and then my layer changes to layer 0. And now I can rename that to something else if I wanted to, like original. And make any kind of changes to it. Okay. Let me go back to revert to the original. But in practice and by habit, I tend to, instead of affecting the background layer, simply do a Control J or Command J to create a duplicate, and now I can make changes to this layer. Then I will turn this background layer off. We're going to talk more about hiding and turning layers on and off. So that's your introduction to the background layer. It's only there initially. Once you start working inside Photoshop, that background layer will necessarily go away. Depends if you do a Control or Command J or not. So you can make changes to that image. All right, so that's the background layer. The next type of layer, which is the image layer, which a background layer really is also an image layer. And it's the default layer when creating a new layer. So either by creating a new layer by hitting an icon in the layers panel, or we bring an additional image in, is going to create what we call an image layer. Let me demonstrate this inside Photoshop. So let's say I have this image here, and I'm going to bring in another image. I don't know if I have one that's really appropriate, but for demonstration purposes, play along with me. Let's say I want to bring in, I'm going to turn these off for now, this image into the lavender image. I'm going to select all of this and just do a Control C or Command C. Go back to my lavender and do a Control V or Command V to paste it. Now notice the layer added here. That is an image layer. In this case, the image doesn't cover the entire background image, so I see in the thumbnail, in the layers panel, I see these checkered boxes indicating there's transparency, so I can see the image behind it because this image does not cover the entire area. I can move this image around. Notice the thumbnail in the layer shows me where the transparent pixels are. In this case, now on the left side, and the content of this layer covers the right side. Okay. So again, Photoshop just sees these pixels on layer 2. We see a wedding picture. On layer 1, it sees pixels that are green and purple. We see lavender with green in the background. Okay. So that's an image layer. Other types of layers. Just to make sure I covered everything with image layer. Oh yeah, the other way to create an image layer, let me cover those as well. You can also, on the bottom of your layers panel, the icon right next to the wastebasket is the option to create a new layer. If I click on that, it creates a blank layer, which is an image layer, if you will. So that's another way to create an image layer. And then you can also do it, of course, anything, there's always more than one way to do something inside Photoshop. You can also come up to the layer option. Inside Photoshop, click on layer, choose new layer. and get the same thing. Okay, so different ways to create a new layer, which defaults to being an image layer. Let's look at the second type of layer, which is the type layer. Anytime we use the text tool inside Photoshop, we're going to create a type layer or a text layer. A text layer allows you to re-edit the text at some point. And one thing to remember about text layers, which I run into a lot, and especially as you're starting to use Photoshop, is if you're adding a second text layer, so you want two different text layers, it's important to, when you, if you just created your first text layer, to start the second text layer somewhere else in the document. Otherwise, it's going to go back to your first text layer. And I'm not sure if I can actually demonstrate this, but let's try this. So let me remove this layer for now. And let's add some text to this lavender image. So there's my first text document. And let's say I want to add purple right above that. So notice in my layers panel right now, my active layer is this highlighted layer, which is the lavender, the text layer. I'm going to grab my text tool. And if I want to add purple, notice if I click near there, it's going to jump right back into my lavender layer. So even though I went off the text tool, came back to it, I want to put it right here. So it's still jumping into the lavender text layer. So what I recommend doing, because I want to keep the word purple as a separate layer, I'll grab my text tool. Even though I want it to be up here, I'm just going to put it down here for now. Notice it now created a new layer because I clicked down here versus near my lavender word, and I'll type in purple. Maybe. There we go. I can grab that and put that like so. So those are now two different layers with a word on each layer. And by default, the text layer or type layer, the name of that layer will default to whatever the text is that you typed in, which is a great way to identify it. So that's the text layer. And for those that may not have been here a few weeks ago, I did a webinar on using the text tool and called it 5 Notable Photoshop Techniques using the text tool. And the link that I send you for this recorded webinar, if you scroll down on that page, you'll see this webinar, 5 Notable Photoshop Text Techniques. So I go further in exploring the text tool and how to do type layers. Let's look at the next layer type, which is a shape layer. A shape layer occurs whenever I'm going to add a shape to a document. I think I demonstrated the use of the shape tool, probably one of the first several webinars that we did. But just to remind ourselves, let's say, I don't know, maybe I'm going to put some kind of credit down here on the bottom right of this lavender image, and I want the text to be able to be more readable. So I'm going to add a shape behind that to kind of fade the background back more. So I'm going to grab my shape tool, which is down here about 2/3 down or 3/4 down in the toolbar. And we'll go with a rounded rectangle tool. We'll go with a white fill. I'm going to eliminate any stroke and just simply click and drag. And there's my shape. Now, since we're talking about layers, let's observe what that looks like in our layers panel. A shape layer will have this little shape in the bottom right of the thumbnail of that layer. I should have mentioned a text layer has the big T, so these are different ways to identify types of layers. And here's the shape layer. I'm going to move that above here. And if I was to go on into to do other things in the document and I want to come back and make changes to this shape, simply select it here, then go up in the properties panel, say I wanted to make it a black fill. Whoops, a black fill, like so. You can do that after the fact. So a shape layer retains its editability, if you will. I'm not sure if that's a word, but you get the idea of being able to go back and make changes to that shape. But that's how that's identified in the layers panel, is this type of, for example, if I'm going to go back and add another shape just so you can see this. So this is a circle that I added. Even though it's a circle, it still shows up like this in my layers panel. So this is the thumbnail indicator of what a shape. This is a shape layer. And notice by default, the shape layer's name is the actual shape that I used. Okay, so that's a shape layer. Let's clean this up a bit by deleting that layer. And let's change this one back to a white, like so. And let's go back to our slideshow. And I covered this, I believe, when we were talking about the tools. So this is webinars from towards the beginning when I started doing these webinars just a couple months ago. When adding a shape layer, if you want to do a perfect circle or a square, hold down hold down Shift to do that. If you want to draw from the center out versus from the top left to the bottom right, you hold down Alt or Option to do that. Those are just little techniques on using the shape layer. Or I should say adding shapes to our documents. The next type of layer is an adjustment layer. And I'll do another webinar just talking about adjustment layers, or I might call it color correction, since I use adjustment layers to do color correction on our images. But we use adjustment layers to make some kind of shift with our image. It usually has to do with color or light or contrast or brightness. The reason we use an adjustment layer is because it's non-destructive, meaning I can add an adjustment layer to my Photoshop document, but if I ever want to go back and change that adjustment or remove that adjustment, I can do that. And I can do the same techniques not using an adjustment layer, but if I don't use an adjustment layer, I can't get back and make any changes to that. I can make additional changes to the whole document, but not to that specific adjustment. Whereas an adjustment layer allows us to do that. So it's the preferred and highly recommended way of making especially any adjustments with color, brightness, contrast, going to black and white, etc. And simply because we can always go back and edit adjustment layers. To add adjustment layers to Photoshop, so you know what that looks like. If I go back to inside Photoshop, and let's see. Yeah, I'll do this. I'm going to click on the layer 1 in my layers panel, because I'm going to add an adjustment layer to the image itself. An adjustment layer affects all layers below it. So I'm going to click on the layer 1, so it affects just the image. And let's say I want to take these lavenders to black and white, just to show you this quickly. I'll do a lot more with adjustment layers sometime in the future, but it's just so to introduce you to an adjustment layer. The adjustment panel usually sits right above the layers panel, and it has just these different sets of icons, different types of adjustment layers. One of them is a black and white adjustment layer. I'm going to click on that. Well, anytime we add an adjustment layer, three things happen. First, it makes that adjustment using the default settings to our image. Second, it adds an adjustment layer to our layers panel. And this is what an adjustment layer looks like in the layers panel. We have a little like a yin-yang thing happening here, and then a mask locked to that or linked to that. And it's going to call it the adjustment that we applied. In this case, it's black and white. So it makes a change in our image. It adds a layer to our layers panel. And the third thing it does, it opens up the properties for that type of adjustment. And then we can change the parameters or the properties for this adjustment via this properties panel. And right now, this just shows how it's changed the different colors, if you will, of the image to black and white. And if I wanted my reds, actually, let me pick on the purples. If I wanted my magentas to go darker, to go black, I could do this. Okay. So I'm not training you how to use adjustment layers at this point or the details of adjustment layer. I just want to introduce you to adjustment layers and what happens when we add an adjustment layer. Now, if I go off of this layer, and at some point I want to come back to that adjustment and say, this is too dark for me, so I want to change how this adjustment was applied. I simply go back to that layer in my layers panel, double click on this little yin yang icon in that layer to bring up my properties, and I can make adjustments to that adjustment layer, if you will. Okay, so that's an adjustment layer. Adjustment layers, again, are used to change color, brightness, contrast, light, etc. And it's a non-destructive way of doing it, because I can remove this adjustment layer. I can make changes to that adjustment layer at any point. If I was to save this out and come back to the same image tomorrow, this layer would still be here. Or I can remove that entire layer and go back to the original. So that's an adjustment layer, the other type of layer that we were talking about. All right, let's move into another type of layer just to make sure I've covered adjustment layer. Sure did. Then the last type of layer is called a smart object layer. Now this is actually the way we nest Photoshop documents or Illustrator documents into a Photoshop document. The beauty of a smart object layer is that you can bring, excuse me, you can bring in another, one second. Apologize for that. We can bring in another Photoshop or Illustrator document into the Photoshop document we're working on, but still edit that document inside its native program or native software or native software program, if you will. So it allows us to keep the editing of that extraneous Photoshop or Illustrator document into its authoring program and separate from our Photoshop document. So that sounds like I'm talking in circles there. So let me just demonstrate this to you. If I go to this image, turn these layers back on, and I'm going to talk about turning layers off and on in just a sec. Notice these layers. Notice the way these layers show up in the layers panel. It's not just simply an image layer. An image layer would just be a picture of an image or a second picture of an image with transparency pixels around it. But these layers have that, but it had, excuse me, has an additional icon here in the bottom right indicating it's a smart object layer. If I hover over that, I think I'll get a little text tool that pops up saying or indicating smart object thumbnail. Plus you get this little mask next to it. So the way a smart object works is if I bring another Photoshop document in, it creates this smart object layer. If I double click on that, actually I had this open before I started the webinar. Let me close this. If I double click on this, you notice it changed, but actually what happened there, it took that layer, which was inside this test template, and opened it up inside this .psb. So if I make a change here, I don't know, we'll add some text. I'm going to save this. And then close that. It jumps me back to where I had double clicked on that smart object layer, and notice the text now shows up here. So this image is actually a separate image, and it's using also a mask to only show that part of the image. So here's another smart object, which is set up there. We also notice this bottom layer indicates a smart object, and it's not necessarily an image that open up in a separate window, but what this one is, it has smart filters. And again, I'll probably do another webinar on smart filters. We're adding, instead of just adding a filter, we do it via a smart filter. So I can go back and make changes to that filter after the fact. Okay. Yeah, now this isn't always true, but there's a comment there. And notice it also added the text to this image. These are actually layers of the same image over and over. So any change I make to any of these will show up here. Let me see. I don't know if I can do this where it's not going to be too confusing. Let me see what else I have open here. That's too busy. Let's try this one. It's been a while since I did this. Let me see if I can do this. Dun, 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 dun. I think I'll keep that. It's going to get too complex and too deep too quickly. I'm going to probably do another webinar on smart object layers. The goal for this morning, though, is just to introduce you to smart object layers, what they look like in the layers panel, and why we might use smart object layers. It'd be fun to bring in an Illustrator file. Notice we have this option to open a smart object. So I'm going to show this to you. So I'm going to open the same lavender as a smart object. Notice the thumbnail in the layers. We have a little smart object indicator at the bottom right of that thumbnail. If I do a copy of this, I get another smart object layer. So this is kind of similar to what we saw in this image, where we have duplicates of the same image and then they mask out part of it. So that's how we get this effect happening. Okay. So that allows me to keep this layer. When I edit this, I can keep it separate. Whoops. Separate from the other layers. Okay. Yeah, we'll do more with smart object layers, and I'll just do a whole webinar smart object layers. We can dig deeper into that because I see some questions coming across about that. So I'm going to save those questions till when I do the webinar on that, on just smart object layers, so we can understand that a little more fully. But for now, we understand what smart object layers are. We'll do another webinar on how to create them, how to use them, how to manipulate smart object layers. Yeah, I will certainly do that, and thank you for that request. All right, so that's the smart object layer. Smart object layer just keeps the layer in its own document, if you will. And we'll do more with that in a later webinar. Okay, let's talk about managing layers, because this is where the beauty of layers comes in, is because everything is on its own layer. So a text is on its own layer, a graphic, a logo that I brought in is on its own layer, an image is on its own layer, and I could have multiple text layers, multiple graphic layers, multiple image layers. The beauty of that is that now I can manage those as separate elements, or I can link those to other layers, or I can group those to other layers. So let me go through these different ways of managing layers inside Photoshop. First of all, we can rearrange layers. Let me go to one of the other documents I have open where this will be more effective. Yeah, we'll do this one. Okay, just to introduce you a bit to what we see here. It's obvious what we see, but I want to explain the layers panel and how that results in what we see here. So it's a plate with different different type of fish items, if you will, on the plates. If I observe the layers panel, let me expand this a bit. We have a background layer. And notice the background actually had all of these elements on its own layer. So this is a way to turn layers off and on. But then it selected each element, so each type of elements that's sitting on that plate is in its own layer. So there's the sand dollar. Now when I remove it, you're still going to see it because it's still part of the background layer. But I could rearrange these. Now to make this, I'm going to move these around. Actually, this is bad. I need to go to a different one because of how this has been set up. Let's go to this one. Okay, this is a postcard. Let's observe the layers that are in this document. Here's the earth. So this was started by doing a file new and setting up a new document because our background layer is just white. It's our background color. Then we started bringing in elements. So we have clouds. We have two pineapples layers. We have a flower layer. I'm going to turn these off and on so you can see these. There's our flower layer. There's our beach scene. Another flower layer. So again, you can see the beauty of layers because each of these elements are in its own layer. There's a little postage stamp in the middle of it. There's our text. And there's a little white border around it. Okay. So I could rearrange these layers. So let's say I wanted to, and I'll do this for demo purposes, you probably wouldn't want to do this for reals, but if I take the Hawaii layer, so I just simply click and drag this down below flower 2. So as I drag it down, notice I think you can see this through the video. The double line that shows up, that's where the double line is, it tells me where it's going to replace that layer if I was to release at that point. So I'm going to release right here. So the Hawaii layer now is just under flower. And that's what we see here. So you kind of get this 3D effect happening. So layers work like if back in the old days, if you will, when we worked with they were called projectors, and we would put transparencies on top of each other. That's the way layers work. You can move these up and down. If I bring this down below pineapple, and that kind of goes behind pineapple. We have 2 copies of pineapple. Take it down one other layer. Now we don't even see it. It's there because we see it in our layers panel. It's on because we see this little visible icon, but we don't see it because it's covered up by layers on top of it. Okay. So right now it sits above beach. I'm sorry. It is above beach and below flower, that flower in the top right. Let me bring it down to here. Now if I was to move the word Hawaii, notice how it interacts with other layers on that. So now it sits below these 3 items, the beach, the postage, and this flower, and that corresponds to what we see in the layers panel. So that's how you can rearrange layers and make them show up behind other aspects of your document. The beauty of layers. Control Z that down. We can also turn them off or on. And I've demoed this already. There's this eye icon at the left of each layer in the layers panel. Turning that off or on hides that layer or brings that layer back. And I will do this sometimes even when I'm working on a document. I'll turn off some layers so don't accidentally grab them and move them around. You can also do what we call lock layers, which I'll show you in a sec. Also notice when you're working with layers, let's say I want to move this word flower. So it's very tempting just to go to our move tool and click on flower thinking we're going to move that, but we end up moving something else. Yes, it happens all the time. That's because by default, it's going to move your active layer in the layers panel. So it's going to move the highlighted layer. In this case, Hawaii is my highlighted layer. So as I click and drag, that's what it moves. If I wanted to move that flower, I select the flower and then click and drag. Okay. There is, see if I can find this. There is an option. I don't know where that is. To select, to move the layer that I click on. And I got so used to making sure the layer I want to move is selected in the layers panel that I don't use that anymore. And I would probably suggest getting used to using your layers panel, selecting the layer you want to move first, and then grabbing your move tool to do that. Because it becomes easier, especially if you want to move something behind something else, you may not be able to get to it as easily. So just select it in the layers panel and then move it. All right, so we talked about rearranging layers up or down. We talked about turning them off or on. We can also lock layers. So let's say I don't want to accidentally move this flower anymore. Because notice when I did move that flower, there's more to it, and it was nicely placed up here in the top right corner. So I'm going to lock that down. I can simply click on, actually I can right click on that layer. There's a couple ways to do this. Right click on this and do, I'm sure there's probably a lock layer in here somewhere. I'm not seeing it, so let's do it another way. Click on that and just click on this little lock icon that's at the top of the layers panel. And it will place a lock on that image, or that layer I should say. Now when I try and move that, even though it's the selected layer, it's not doing anything. It's not moving it because that layer is locked. Nice. Now I'm not going to spend too much time with this, but there's different things you can lock in this layer. I'm going to click on that to remove that lock. There's other things you can lock down in the layer besides just locking down the whole layer. You can lock this to the artboard. I haven't really talked about artboards. I'll save that for another time. But an artboard is simply, say I'm doing say a business set for a client where they want letterhead, logo, and a business card. So I can create all those elements, all those items inside one Photoshop document with different artboards. So I have a letterhead artboard, a business, excuse me, a business card artboard, and a logo artboard. And I can place these elements across those boards. This lockdown prevents that from happening, so it only stays on one artboard. We can lock down the position of a layer. So if I click on that, it's a little lock icon here. I can try moving that around. It will not move it because it says no can do. However, it's only the position that's locked down. So if I wanted to, let's say I want to remove part of this image, it will let me do that. Okay. The other types of locks can lock the pixels, so you can't make any changes to the color of the pixels, etc. You can also lock down the transparency pixels. So you can't do anything else from the clear, you can't do anything to the clear pixels, if you will, on that layer. All right, so that's locking a layer and locking different aspects of a layer. Let me remove any locks on that. We can also link layers. Let's say the word Hawaii and the island paradise. I want those to always stay together. So I'm going to select Hawaii. I'm going to control click on island paradise to select that. So now I have two layers selected. I'm going to link those together via this little link icon at the bottom of the layers panel. And I get a little visual indicator by this little lock icon that shows up on those two layers in the layers panel. Now if I was to go just to Hawaii and click on that, I notice the link icon shows up. It also shows up for the island properties. If I was to move this around, notice Island Paradise goes along with it. That's kind of a cool effect. So that's why you might link layers, because you want those two or more layers to stick together. You simply link those layers together. So even though I did not select Island Paradise, I only selected Hawaii, when I go to move it, it's going to move all the linked layers to it's going to move all the layers that are linked to that active layer. So that's linking layers. If I want to unlink them, I simply click on one of them and click on the link icon again to unlink them. Another way of keeping layers together, but maybe not necessarily linking them together, but maybe just organizing them, is by groups. Let's see if I have another example here. Let's not do that one. Let's do this one. Oh, there's a question back here. Let me address that. That's a good question. Let me go back to, they're asking why this Hawaii layer doesn't show up as text. As a text layer, this is showing up as an image layer. A text layer always has a big T. An image layer always has the transparency with whatever the content of that layer is. And that's what we see here next to the word always. Doesn't indicate it's a text layer at all. The reason that is not a text layer is originally it was a text layer. They used some kind of big font to create the word Hawaii. Then they turned it into an image layer. And the way you do that, let's see if I can have the option here. The way they did that is they said rasterize type. So let me make a copy of this so you can see this. I just did a Control J on the Island Paradise layer. I'm going to turn off the original one. If I do a rasterize type, notice it turns into an image layer. Now it still looks the same, but now what I could do is if I wanted to apply a gradient to the words Island Paradise, I can select the text. I just did a control click on the thumbnail, select that. Now I can go to my gradient tool and apply that. That is one of the techniques. If you go back and watch that previous webinar on the link I will send to you, I think I covered that. Yeah, doing gradient text. So rasterizing the layer gives you options on what you can do to that text after the fact. So on Hawaii, they added a gradient as well as a stroke around it. Okay. There's probably other ways of doing the same thing, but rasterizing a layer is a common way of doing that. Now the disadvantage of that is it's just pixels, so you can make it larger and smaller. You may not retain the quality. And actually the big disadvantage is you cannot go back and edit that text. If I wanted to say Hawaii now, so add a word after it, I can't go back there and use my text tool to do that because it's no longer a text layer. It is an image layer. All right, that's a good question. Let's go back to, we were talking, I think, about grouping layers, and I was going to this one, yeah. So this is a Photoshop document that was created to do a website. So they did a mock-up inside Photoshop before they actually went into, say, Dreamweaver or somewhere else to actually create the web page or website. And I think we have an example. Yeah, we have an example of a group right here. Notice this layer has a folder icon. That's a group layer. And I have an arrow right next to it. If I click on that, it expands that group and shows me the layers inside there. So this group is identified as button text. So it's actually this menu over here on the far left. So grouping layers is a great way to organize your content. So if it's like the same type of content or used the same way, you can group those together. And the way they did that was by creating button text. So let me show you how you group layers. So we have two images here. I'm going to call these like overlay images. I'm going to group these together just so I can keep my layers manageable inside my layers panel. So I'm going to select both layers, right click on either of those layers and say group from layers. I'm going to call it overlay images. Now I have a little folder icon in my layers panel. If I expand that, I see those two layers that I put inside that group. So it's a great way to organize your layers and keep them manageable, especially if you start getting lots and lots of layers. Group them together so it's easier to maintain. Okay, back to our slideshow. All right, so we covered those aspects of managing layers. There's a few more things we can do with layers when it comes to managing layers. We can merge layers. Let me go through these 4 items as well. Merge layers. Let's see if I can find a good example where we might merge layers. Okay, we'll follow up on this one. So what we did with this image, our last step is we actually made Island Paradise. We rasterized that together. And let's say, and I probably would not recommend doing this in real life, but just to demo this on why we might merge layers. Let's say I know that this image layer that is identified as Hawaii and this now image layer, which is identified as Island Paradise copy, I will always want these to stay together. I'm not going to make a change to them separately. I can merge them together. So I'm going to click on both of those layers to select them. I'm going to say merge layers. Now notice I no longer have a Hawaii layer. I have Island Paradise copy. If I go to move that, Hawaii comes with it because now that's one layer. So I've merged those layers together. So that's how you merge layers. Let's look at opacity and blend mode. This is one of the beauties of layers also, is the ability to affect transparency of a layer as well as to change blend modes. Let's go back to this one. No, let's not. let's stick with the one that we were just at. Which one was that? Yeah. Okay, I'm still on my text. Let's look at opacity. At the top of the layers panel, we have an opacity setting. It will always default to 100. If I want to bring that down so I can see through this, I can do something like this. Actually, let's do this flower down here at the bottom left. I'm going to highlight that layer and bring down its opacity. So now you can kind of see behind it. You can do some very cool things with opacity. That's the opacity setting in layers panel. Then we also have, let me bring that back up before I go to the next one. We also have the blend mode, which is right next to opacity on the left of opacity. And that is, it's hard to define blend mode. Blend mode is a blending of that layer's pixels with the colors underneath it. So meaning the colors in the layers below that. So let's change this so you can see this. I'm going to go to dissolve. Now we're going to watch this flower here as I go through these. So this is my highlighted field. I'm going to just click the down arrow to go through the different types of blend modes. And you're going to see different effects of how the flower's pixels are interacting with the pixels below it. So you get some really different types of effects happening. And those are just fun to play with. And I'll probably do a whole other webinar on just blend modes. If I remember, I'll put a link with this recording to I think it's a free download of all the different blend modes, and it includes explanations and demonstrations of the blend modes. So you can get some really neat effects just experimenting with blend modes with layers. And again, this is only affecting, or it's changing the blend of the active layer to all the layers below it. And finally, the last thing about layers is adding and deleting layers, which I think I've already showed you. To add a layer, simply click on the little add layer icon at the bottom of the layers panel. To delete a layer, click it, click the wastebasket. It goes away, or you can also click on that layer and drag it to the wastebasket. Okay. Yeah, there's a question about this fill option here at the top of the layers panel, how that differs from opacity. It acts very, very similar, to be honest with you, but there is a difference, and I think it shows up when you're using shapes. If you bring down the fill, it will only affect the feel of the shape and not the stroke of the shape. So you can maintain the stroke, but see through the actual shape itself to what's behind it. That's a good question, because it initially doesn't seem to be much difference. Okay, so that's it, I think, as far as managing layers. That's a ton of information. I apologize, this webinar goes a little bit longer than they usually do, but I'd like to get all this covered. So that kind of wraps up my intentions for this morning. We covered what is a layer, the purpose of layers, the different types of layers, and then how to manage layers. And I'm going to go through the last slides rather quickly. These slides are on every webinar, so you can look at previous webinars to get more information. Actually, this one isn't, though. I will include these links below the recording of this webinar, just some other resources to learn more about Photoshop layers. This one here I sent out If you get my newsletter that goes out on Thursdays, I think this one was in the newsletter yesterday. This is a great introduction to layers. And this one is too, actually. I think between both of these resources, you'll come to a great understanding of layers. For those that haven't yet, you can get some free, I think 6 free Photoshop videos. Yeah, it's 6, it says right there. That shows you how to do different types of editing techniques to your images, different ways to find out more about Photoshop on my own site, and my contact information. All right, it's approaching 9 o'clock, so I want to wrap this up. Thank you all for joining me this morning. Thank you for your interest in this, your questions in this, and don't ever hesitate. You're free to contact me throughout the week as well if you run into questions, especially if you're working with layers this next week. If you have any questions, shoot off an email to me. The email is karma@onwardstudios.com. And usually I do a Photoshop webinar on the 4th Friday. I won't be able to do that next Friday. I'm doing actually a web accessibility workshop here in the Denver area. So I'm tied up that morning, but I will be doing a Photoshop webinar the following Friday. In fact, I'm changing my schedule up a bit. I used to be doing WordPress webinars. I'm going to hold that off a little bit, just focus on Photoshop for a while. So we'll be doing Photoshop webinars probably the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Fridays of each month. But do plan to join me again in 2 weeks, and we'll do another Photoshop webinar. And watch your emails for what that will be about. All right, again, thank you to each of you for joining me this morning. I appreciate you taking the time. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Thank you.